Hello. So this presentation is going to be on a particular kind of bias that can show up in scientific communities. And it's really very closely based on this essay by Kathleen Okruhlik in the mid-90s. And so she's focusing on the role of gender disparity, or the lack of gender diversity that was certainly around in the biological sciences for many years leading up and through the 1990s. Interestingly, that has somewhat changed, in fact pretty significantly changed in recent years. But nevertheless, she was analyzing some of the gender biases that show up in the scientific research itself in surprising ways, places where you might not think it would show up. And to sort of frame her essay here and her whole argument, we need to go back to some stuff from N.R. Hansen and Thomas Kuhn. And remember, in particular, Thomas Kuhn was talking about scientific paradigms and how those paradigms can shape, in fact, do shape, everything that happens in normal science, sort of the way professional scientists conduct their work, how they design their research programs and collect evidence, and how they report it to their peers, and how they train new people into the field. That's all part of the paradigm. It shapes everything about how scientists do their work. And in particular, that's mostly relevant to this issue is that it helps to frame the sort of thing that's worth studying, right? So what is it exactly that we're studying? Where are the interesting avenues for new research within this paradigm? So when any researcher, a new researcher or a seasoned researcher is trying to find work to do in their field of research, they consult their paradigm. And there's some well-known problems or questions that are embedded in every active paradigm that scientists can do work on, try to solve that puzzle, try to answer that question. And the paradigm not only provides you sort of with these avenues of research, but it also helps you to figure out what is an answerable question. What's the kind of question that can be answered? Then also, what would be interesting to try to answer? How do you answer it? What sorts of research should you conduct to try to solve this problem? What kinds of answers should we expect? Now, of course, it's not going to tell us exactly the answers. We have to do the research, but it should give us at least a rough sense of what kinds of results we're likely to get if we do conduct this research. So it's all shaped by the paradigm. And that's just the way science works. But there's this particular form of bias that can show up when science is working this way. And Kathleen Okruhlik in her essay identifies some interesting examples of how this maybe has shown up in biological research. And so one of the examples she includes is research on fertilization, so the joining of egg and sperm in animals. And so there was a subtle aspect of this paradigm for many, many decades, in fact, as far back as we can identify when people were first noticing sort of how this works at a cellular level. And the idea was that the female egg sits there pretty much passively. It doesn't really do much of anything. It's just ready to accept a sperm. And the sperm are the active ones. They're the ones that are vigorously swimming and trying to compete with each other to be the one that fertilizes the egg. And if we want to make it sound, kind of melodramatic, this almost starts to sound a little bit like the princess in distress with Prince Charming coming to rescue her, right? She's just sort of sitting there, and it's the prince that has to do all this work and manage all these adventures and so on and all these hardships in order to finally reach the princess. And then once she does, then they kiss, right? And they join. And so that's kind of the picture that she's painting here. And maybe researchers wouldn't have specifically said it that way, but there's this subtle influence of that attitude of gender roles that was playing into this research. Because if you want to find out what's really going on, you study the sperm and how they manage to get there and how they manage to penetrate into the egg. The egg itself, there's things to research there, but it's really not doing anything. So if you want the active part, you look at the sperm. Well, that assumption was then finally challenged when more women got into the field and started to look at any active roles that the eggs were playing, and lo and behold, they found some. The eggs actually send little filaments out to particular sperm and do part of the selecting for which sperm is going to be the one that actually does the fertilization. So there is an active role for the egg. And if you weren't specifically trying to look for it, then you would never sort of set up your microscope slides and so on in a way that would help you to actually see it. If you're not bothering to look at what the egg is doing, you're not going to see it under these circumstances. Because you need to prepare your samples in a particular way depending on what you're actually trying to find. And so they were looking at what the sperm were doing, not the egg. So that's one example. Here's another example. It's not specifically biological research, but it's sort of an interesting phenomena among students in the United States. So there's this gender difference in standardized test scores, which of course, almost all school-age children in the United States need to take these standardized tests every once in a while, and they have these different sections on math and verbal understanding and those sorts of things. And it turns out that girls, by and large, on average, were doing much better at the part of the test that were testing verbal skills, whereas the parts of the test that were testing spatial reasoning, the boys were doing better at that. So that's just an empirical result. It's just what was happening with these tests. So that presents an immediate research question, right? So this is something that's interesting, what's going on here? And so it's a natural research question to ask, what is the biological basis for this difference? Girls are doing better at one part, boys at the other one. So what is the biology behind this? So this launched extensive research efforts, and they looked at things like, relative brain sizes or sizes of different parts of the brain between men and women, things like the body to brain size ratios between men and women. And it turns out that none of these attempts to biologically explain the difference in these test scores was panning out to show any usable results. There was just no correlation between, these features and performance on tests. And so they were kind of stuck. It's like, so what's going on here? There's this difference in test scores and there's no explanation. Well, maybe you noticed it. There wasn't a problem. I'm going to go back to this previous slide. There was a problem with this research question. There's a bias built into the question itself. And it's right here. What is the biological basis for this difference? It was assumed that the difference here is a biological one. And so if we want to explain why there's a difference in test scores, we need to look at the biology. And it turned out that that just isn't the case. A better research question, a less biased research question would be this, even though I don't have it phrased as a question here, what is the basis of the difference? And if you throw in biological there, then that automatically puts sort of blinders on you, where you're just looking at the biology and you don't notice other things that might have a pretty big influence. And so it's been discovered, and to a certain extent, these scores have been narrowing because there have been some efforts to try to correct for this. But there's some socio-cultural explanations. The way boys are treated when they're very young and as students and just sort of as sons, and then the way girls are treated and the expectations from boys to girls, expectations about what sort of proper girl activities versus proper boy activities when they're young. And it turns out that this can account for a large degree of this difference. So, think boys, they're playing with blocks or Legos or sort of building things and then smashing them. They're playing sports, and so it's three-dimensional things, balls moving and momentum transfer and angles and those kinds of things are happening with younger boys. And so that was they had sort of an intuitive sense of the spatial reasoning. Whereas the girls, the stereotype is that they were encouraged to play with dolls and play house, and it's a lot of talking and stuff, and those kinds of interpersonal conflicts, as opposed to boys, which are just sort of smashing things, building things and smashing them. And so those are the stereotypes. And there's some truth to that stereotype of the way little boys and little girls have been treated for decades and decades, and the assumptions about gender roles. So recent efforts to try to increase girls' participation in sports, for example, has helped to narrow this gap a lot, at least for girls' scores on the spatial reasoning test. Okay, so here's the problem then, to sort of bring this back to Okruhlik's central argument in terms of the bias that shows up in science. So even when scientists are trying, they recognize the threat of bias, and they're trying to be fair and unbiased. Nevertheless, some bias can creep into the way that they phrase their research questions and the way they design their research programs, their experiments, and so on. Some bias can creep in there without them even noticing that it's happening, because it's such a subtle and deep assumption or set of assumptions within their paradigm that they don't even notice that this is potentially a source of bias. And so, as I say here, this can send research down the wrong path. You're wasting all kinds of time and resources studying and trying to answer a research question that was poorly phrased. And it prevents sort of the truth being discovered on some of these questions, and real solutions being discovered for some of these problems. So what do? Well, what sort of a maybe too quick answer was, oh, well, let's decrease people's bias, maybe even eliminate people's individual bias. Then we will be able to pursue science with a clear mind without any problems of bias. Like, well, that's maybe, well, first of all, it might be impossible, right? We're all humans, and we all have biases of various kinds. And if we erase all of those biases, then it's not clear that what's left is sort of coherent theories that and levels of expertise that people need in order to actually do high-level research. I mean, in fact, that's sort of one way of thinking about somebody who's an expert in any field, especially in the field of science, is that they are biased in favor of things that they know actually work, things that have actually been discovered, true things that researchers have figured out in the past. They're biased in favor of those things. That's part of what makes them an expert in that field, that they pay attention to those things. But at the same time, that can sort of put these blinders on them, right? That they're focused on these things that they've learned, and if there's something else that's has a big influence on their field that they're studying, but it's not something that people have thought of in the past, then they might not think of it, and they might not notice it. So rather than just trying to eliminate biases, because like I said, that might be impossible, and even if it were possible, it's probably not advisable because you'd be eliminating expertise. So instead, we should include people that just have different biases, different sources of bias, or different blinders, different blind spots, we might say, in their view of the world. So as long as you have people that have different blind spots that are working together, then they can cover each other's blind spots. They can point out to each other that, oh, actually the way you phrase that research question is biased in this interesting way. Let's see if we can correct it. And no one person in the research group is going to be the one that notices all of those, because everybody has their own personal biases. But as long as there's enough diversity, we can sort of notice each other's biases and correct for them collectively. So it's not an individual solution, it's a collective solution to this problem. So one of the reasons why I really like this argument is it's, it might be an argument for something like affirmative action, increasing diversity one way or another, increasing recruitment and encouragement of people with different backgrounds to join into scientific research and become part of a research community. So this increasing diversity can actually help science work better, right? So it's an argument in favor of well-functioning science. So it's an epistemological argument in favor of diversity instead of what we usually see, which are ethical arguments in favor of diversity. And those ethical arguments can be very good and very interesting arguments. So we're correcting for past exclusion or past oppression or repression, and so we make an intentional effort. We've sort of our duty as a matter of justice to increase diversity and increase representation. So those are interesting arguments, but that's ethics, whereas this is epistemology, it's science. And so now we have sort of two different ways of arguing in favor of diversity. The standard one in the sense of ethics and justice, and now one in favor of just doing better science. Okay, so there are some potential problems with this view, as there are with pretty much any view. So things to watch out for, and these aren't necessarily the kinds of problems that sort of defeat the argument. In fact, Okruhlik talks about these potential problems here. We want to be more inclusive, but we also don't want to go so far as to say, all viewpoints are equally valid. No matter whether somebody's an expert or not, and they have just some opinion, or they're on the fringe of this community of researchers, and so we need to consider everybody's ideas equally. Well, it could be that a lot of those ideas are just, they're fringe for a reason, right? Because they're just so implausible and outside of the mainstream that they're actually very likely to be false. But then also, if we're considering sort of too many points of view all at once, we might not ever be able to actually move forward. You spend all of your time kind of negotiating the basic starting points and the basic assumptions without actually developing and executing an actual research agenda. And so at some point you need to sort of stop the discussion and go. So if you're considering everybody's ideas, you might not go anywhere. So these are the kinds of problems that we should watch out for when increasing diversity. But nevertheless, that's sort of my favorite epistemological argument in favor of diversity. All right, so I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks.